Hi.
Hello, my name is Aleya Kassam. I am a founding member and the A in the Lamb Sisterhood, which is a story company. And we fill the world with stories that make African women feel seen, heard, and beloved. We're also preparing our podcast, Brazen, off of the stage show Brazen, to explore the stories of African women from our history like you've never seen yourself before. Today, it is such an honor to be moderating this Africa Podfest panel called Podcasts as Archives, Preserving Cultural Heritage in Africa. It's really an honor to be with both of you. If I could ask my co-panelists to please introduce themselves. Nanjala, maybe we can start with you. Hello.
Hi.
Shall I start?
Go ahead, Samba.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, everyone. It's really exciting to be here. I was really looking forward to coming to Nairobi, but it's so great that we can still do this online. My name is Samba Yonga, and I'm the co-founder of the Women's History Museum here in Zambia. And our mandate is to restore narratives and indigenous knowledge systems into the mainstream with the use of cultural, artistic, and digital media.
Hi, my name is Nanjala. I am a writer and a political analyst based in Nairobi. My work mostly is at the intersection between technology and politics, but I also do a lot of research and writing on feminism and African feminism specifically, and also thinking about refugees and migration and human mobility in general.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'd like to really just begin by setting the scene a little bit and kind of teasing out the idea of what cultural heritage is even. And I'm curious in the work that you do, in the digitizing work and the podcasting work that you do, how is this medium and this form redefining what cultural heritage is? Maybe we can start with you, Samba.
Yeah, sure. I think historically we've all thought of African knowledge or cultural heritage as something being passed down through oral archives. And oral archives meaning our elders, our ancestors passing it on down, and it moving on from generation to generation. And as a result of that, a lot of the history that we've learned, and with the coming of modern technology and modern knowledge and education systems, a lot of that has been lost because then now education transferred into a structured school system where we sit in a classroom and we learn, we write the information, we document it. Whereas for our cultural heritage, we never really did that, or it was done in different ways if you look at the different civilizations. So an opportunity that the new technology and the work we're doing has brought is that now we're allowed to take those oral archives, to take that knowledge and the systems of knowledge that were recorded in different ways, and also apply it to our current systems of knowledge and then mainstream them so that they can become valid systems of knowledge as well.
And Samba, how does podcasting mainstream this sort of knowledge? Because it feels like it might still be niche. What is the way in which you think it is able to center these forms of information?
Well, podcast is very exciting. First of all, Africa listens to a lot of radio. If you do the media monitoring, my communications is in media as well and communication. So we do a lot of research around how are Africans listening to media, how are they consuming media. And by and far for the last 20 years, the majority has been radio. So they listen to a lot of radio, so already they're in the mindset of podcasting. What's different with podcasting is that it's online, but with the accessibility and kind of like the costs coming down of online access, it has allowed for a wider range for people to access podcasting. But more importantly, podcasting is an accessible and affordable way to document information that would have normally taken like a researcher at university to get a grant and a fund to go out into the village and research and ask questions with people. But with podcasting and with digital media, you can just bring together the knowledge, bring together the oral archives, or go to the oral archives, get this knowledge, record it, put it on a podcast, a digital archive. And this is important for also posterity, because it doesn't matter that maybe today it can only reach 10,000 people or 100,000 people. The good thing is it can stay there for eternity. It's internet, to be online forever. So generations down the line can still access it. And that's the beauty with podcasting as heritage archives.
Thank you, Samba. Nanjala, you know, based off of something that Samba just mentioned about like the physical location of archives, that's something that you've spoken about before and touched on in your book. And the fact that then it becomes inaccessible to a lot of African academics. I'm curious about what are some of the unexpected ways in which digitization is changing the game when it comes to archiving.
I think the good news is exactly what Samba says, that, you know, the digital is making access much easier in theory for a lot of people. So, you know, like a podcast, you could disseminate a podcast, for example, through Telegram or through WhatsApp, which a lot of people are doing, and it enables them to reach new audiences. You could have your own channel on Telegram and have conversations, direct conversations with people who are audiences, who are members of the listening community. Podcasts have allowed, especially like news radio stations, to package specific elements of their broadcasting and put it online and allow the information to travel much longer than the life of a radio broadcast. But there is something that we have to be wary of, and that is how digital media companies then insinuate themselves as the organizers of the knowledge. And I can give you like a personal example. In the last year, I've been doing a lot of research on the history of identity systems in Kenya, and how the ID card, for example, the genealogy of the ID card. And one thing that really frustrated me as a researcher who isn't working for a university or whatever, is that I couldn't get access to the Hansard from before 1948 in my own house. Like, you have to have special, even if it's, you know, in theory, Google has this information and it's on the Google, Google Books. But if you don't have institutional access, you can't just log on to it. You have to pay for the access. And it ended up being that it was easier for me to get access to Kenya's parliamentary records at my old university in the UK than it was for me to get it here in Kenya. And I had people, you know, that's a mediating factor, that the people who are organizing this knowledge for us are using to monetize this stuff. So, you know, they can come in and say, hey, we're doing this great job. We're doing this great public service where we're helping Kenya digitize their archives. Well and good. Is it going to be publicly available? Is it going to be available to Kenyan researchers, especially to be able to make use of that information in their research? And what we're seeing so far is that's just not the case. Instead, what's happening is that it's just a different kind of paper. Whereas before, you had to take a matatu or take a taxi or whatever to go to the National Archives in the CBD and then pay 50 bob and get your card and then go and have someone, an archivist, sort of help you through that. What you're doing now is you're then having to pay an American corporation for the right to access your own history. And right now with podcasts, you know, we have all of these platforms that are making this information for free, whether it's iTunes or Spotify or whatever, but or not for free, but relatively for free, because you have to have a subscription. But the subscription model basically means that you're licensing the content from the person who is organizing it for you. You're not paying for it. We saw this, for example, when Amazon withdrew all the electronic copies of 1984 from all the Kindles in the world. Because 1984 is one of the most downloaded books in this particular historical moment, because people see so many resonances with what's happening in the world. When you take something from, you know, your Kindle or from your iTunes store or from Spotify, you're not buying it, you're licensing it from the person who runs the platform. And that is a loss of control. And so far, we haven't, this 1984 story is the most egregious example of this. But it's something that we have to be wary of as we move more and more of our content towards platforms that are mediated by third parties that are not necessarily answerable to our own unique conditions. You know, if we're lucky, we end up with a company like Mozilla that's very focused on the public interest and very focused on, we are never going to monetize this. We're never going to turn into another what do you call it, another bottleneck or another gatekeeper for you. But if you're unlucky, you end up in a point where we've handed over all of this information to a private corporation and we're subject to whatever licensing regime they come up with.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a conversation about power. And in a way, that was the original conversation around the original archives.
Yeah.
The people who wrote the narrative were the ones who were
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, archives are a site for power, and you know, archives, museums, what gets documented is a reflection of the interests of the person who's doing the documenting. When you go to the Louvre, for example, you go to some other massive museum and they tell you, you know, here is Delacroix and his giant, you know, 2 meter by 2 meters painting, which is the best paintings that came out from 18 or 17, God knows when. That's not a reflection of the state of the art in 18th or 17th century. That's a reflection of the interest of the person who had power at that particular moment. And that's why when you go to a lot of Western museums, for example, you go to the African section, it's all masks, it's all drums, it's all, you know, artifacts that reflect how people saw Africa, how people saw Blackness, how power saw Blackness. Nobody was keeping, for example, things that women made, you know, to keep their children alive. You know, where are the calabashes? Where are the, you know, how did women give breast milk to their children when they were on the farms? Where are the artifacts that made that life possible? Because women were not envisioned as agents of history, as part of that story. And women were not interesting to the people who had power. And so this is also reflected in the archives. The stories that get told, that get handed down in the written archives, in the archive as a project, as a government project, often reflect the interests of the people who have power at that particular moment. And so when we're thinking about this now in the digital age, we also have to factor in this whole other group of people, which is the private corporations, which maybe when we were thinking about archives as a government project, we never had to think about before. We were like, well, it's the government, it's your job to keep as much of our history as possible. But now we're having to say, well, ooh, what if these people decide that, for example, the photography archives of the Kenyan News Agency are more important than the photo archives of the Mo Amin Foundation? You know, like that's a decision, that's a political decision that has everything to do with power and access and who gets to make those calls.
And I mean, in a way, Samba Leading Ladies is a reclaiming of some form of power.
Yes.
Telling in a choosing to tell a certain narrative in a certain way. And the response has been really phenomenal. How do you approach the choices that you make to change that narrative? And then how do you navigate this power situation
Thank you. That's really important, and I think the story of power is actually critical at the choice and decisions that we make. Like Nanjala was saying, that the people who have the power are the ones who dictate the stories. So if you go into the museums in the West, they're telling their point of view, and our point of view for generations now has been completely erased. Meaning that we don't have the opportunity to understand both points of view, but only one. And the trouble with that for Africa is then that we subscribe to the point of view that has the power and have completely disregarded or don't have the opportunity to learn the other point of view. So this was the decision we made when we look back into the history, look back into the stories and started understanding, like, wait a minute, a lot of these ideologies that seem to be learned from the West actually existed even before we understood and learned ideologies from the West. And this was obviously before patriarchy was introduced into Africa. And now we live in a world where we look at our own knowledge and disregard it and think the only valid knowledge is the Western knowledge. And what we want to do is point back and show that actually the only reason why you don't have this knowledge and why you think that it's not valid is because the person who had the power or the structure that had the power at the time did not include it as part of a narrative because to them it wasn't important. And what we need to do is start interrogating the things that are important, the things that are invalid, the things that should be part of our narrative as well in terms of knowledge.
One of the things that really struck me, Samba, as you were talking, is this idea also of having knowledge and having ideologies and sharing them with the world, and the sense that in the past, because of our oral culture, we had them, but the ability to broadcast them to a wide audience. We didn't control that medium. And in a way, that was for us, that was one of the urges to go into podcasting, is that we were really interested, through Brazen, we were interested in uninvisibling the lives of these extraordinary Kenyan women from history whose lives had been completely erased. But theatre is so transient. So if you aren't in that moment, in that specific location, it just goes poof into the air. Whereas now with podcasting, you get to be in conversation with the world in a way that is hard to do when you're sitting in Nairobi in a little theater, in a little stage. Nanjala, I sort of based off of that, what are, in your own, in the writing of the book and in the excavation of the archives, what are things that you found your work to be in conversation with that surprises you now, or that you didn't expect?
That's a great question. I think I had always envisioned the book as a project that was going to speak into many different terrains. So there's a conversation, it's in dialogue with feminism, it's in dialogue with tech, it's in dialogue with political history, it's in dialogue with economics even, many of the narratives that we tell ourselves about who we are as a country and how this disconnection or this, I don't want to use the word disruption because I think it flattens out a lot of things, but how does that interruption of technology kind of affect all of these other narratives that we have about ourselves. I think the thing that has most surprised me about this book has been the extent to which people are surprised that Africa is part of these conversations, and the extent to which people are like, oh, I had no idea this was a problem for you guys. I'm like, yeah, it was a problem for us before it was a problem for you. Because there's the meta narrative of, Africa being backward, to put it quite simply. And even when people talk about leapfrogging and tech and all of these advancements, it's always from a very condescending, sort of paternalistic, just mobile money and fintech and everything's great. And it never sort of unpacks the complexities of the societies around it. So I think if there's anything that surprised me, it would be that. It's that I'm surprised that people are surprised that Africa is very much, and Kenya is very much a part of these ongoing conversations about the role that technology is going to play and has played in our lives. I'll say this, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, I actually wrote a podcast, a 6-episode podcast, and we were talking about extrajudicial executions, and we were trying to tell the stories of all the people who get left behind after a person gets killed by the police. And we were trying to say it in a way that made people stop focusing on the act of killing, but really see a person in the story of their lives, their families, their jobs, their histories, and how that the killing is actually a very small part of this broader narrative arc. And the surprise with that particular podcast was how people are really passionate about this narrative in the negative sense. Like people really want it to be that everybody who gets killed by a police officer is a criminal. Because if that they lose that story, then they lose a whole lot of other stories. Then they have to reconcile themselves with the fact that police brutality is actually a bad thing, is actually a problem. It doesn't make you safe. You're stealing people from their family. Like, you know, they have to deal with a whole other complex reality about the place that they live. And one of the main sort of interactions with that was people not wanting to let go of that narrative. Because once you, what is that, where does that leave you when you have to deal with the reality of the police not being the good guys? Like who are you even, you know, in the world when you have to sort of lean into that discomfort? With some very interesting conversations come from that. And I think um, in terms of surprises, that is really one of the things that surprises. Like people are really passionate about their narratives. People are really passionate about their stereotypes. People are really passionate about how they want the world to be organized in their heads. And if you're making a podcast that you want to challenge, you want to go right to the heart of that, you have to be so good. You have to really be so good because you are up against it. Like even the best people in the world, these narratives help them make sense of their place in the world. And if you're challenging that, you better come correct. Otherwise, you're just going to be like, you know, having these strange conversations with people who should ideally, in theory, you know better than to just buy police narratives, for example, without interrogating them.
And I mean, Samba, you are challenging the hell out of history.
Yeah. Yeah, I keep on nodding my head as Nanjala is speaking, and that is exactly it. I mean, I've just made a list of all the ideas that we're challenging in terms of even indigenous knowledge, in terms of stereotypes and how we see ourselves. One of the most obvious ones is obviously, I mean, we have whole industries running around women's leadership and how we need to include women in participation and politics and all of that. And as we did this research, it was so mind-boggling when we published the podcast, and it focused on women leaders before colonialism who held very significant positions of leadership. I mean, we're talking about generals, heads of state, secretaries of state, and we deliberately used the phrases secretary of state, which is very modern and very masculine, so people can understand the stereotype and actually turn it on its head and see that, oh, in Zambia, before all of this feminism, women's leadership was introduced to us, we already had it. You know, we were already doing that. Gender equality was already being practiced. There's this favorite story we like to share about Wediango in the South, who was the original matriarch of the Kingdom of Victoria Falls. And she brokered a deal with an invading chief to have a co-leadership. And that co-leadership still exists today. The descendants are the ones who are still on the throne. And it's one of the most powerful chiefdoms in Zambia. And we're like, that's gender equality. So how do we have this whole system, this juggernaut of a westernized system that comes and tells us you need to practice gender equality, you need to give women more inclusion? And when you understand, because you obviously asked the question, like, why don't we know this? Why don't we learn about this in schools? But then when you go back to the archives, you actually understand that when the chief and chieftainess went to present themselves to the Boma, to the colonial office, they refused to acknowledge the woman, because to them they were like, women are not leaders, so we can't put you down as a chieftainess. And that's how that history passed out of our knowledge. And that's how come we don't know. But in their own community, they still practice it. And that's why today, Wediango and Mukuni are still king and queen, essentially. And that knowledge is not applied in our everyday life. And for us, that's very important to show that you actually do have valid systems of knowledge that can be still applicable today, that if even inculcated and applied, can have more impact than all these systems that we're trying to adopt from the West. Because let's face it, it's a very different context. And a lot of the times that's why there's a challenge in accepting it and applying it and even using it even in our own context, because it's completely different.
Samba, when you're telling these stories, there's a phrase that Nanjala used that I love so much, the idea of really seeing a person in the story of their lives. And it strikes me as true even to the work that you're doing with leading ladies. What do you choose to leave out? Because when you're telling a story, what you choose to leave out is as important as what you choose to put in.
Absolutely. And I think I always think of it in the way I read a lot of Yuval Noah Harari. And it's fascinating how he talks about evolution and the world and how it came about. And he talks about everything, the good and the bad. I think one of the things that we fail to understand that in all civilizations, there was the good and the bad. That's how it is. That's how you evolve. And that's how you change. You realize something is bad, you have to move on from that, cut it out, and apply the better system. And I think for Africa, what has happened is that we focus a lot on the bad. We focus a lot on the bad and not tell the story of the good systems of knowledge, the good things that happen. We kind of like forget about that, disregard that, but hone in like really strongly and like blow up and zoom in like all these bad things. We're not denying that the bad is there. And I think in a lot of ways, the bad practices that have been there they are being decampaigned, and a lot of it is not publicized. Well, for us, we choose not to add that. But what we do say is compare the narrative, compare what has been good and what didn't work and what they chose. For example, the Bediango story, you can already immediately see that the chief wanted to invade and take over, but she was able to step in and navigate and was supported by a community. And that was the good thing. So they did away with the bad thing. So it is very valid and to approach and address the bad thing because you want to remove it from a society. But I think for Africa, we have to really remember that that's the process of all civilization. That's what happens. And we need to go through that process as well.
And in a way, in removing the bad, it kind of makes me think about the ways in which our own history, the erasure that's happened, not just a long time ago, but even quite recently. And Nanjala, I think I read in an interview somewhere, you were mentioning how as you were doing the research, you couldn't find whole chunks of our history in the archives.
Yeah.
How do you fill in the gaps?
Well, it's interesting. Like, a lot of African contemporary history is editorialized, and that is a product of authoritarianism. Like, people who have power want to tell a specific story that makes it possible to justify their longevity in power. So in Kenya, what you find with our archives is a great deal of interruption. Wherever there is political sort of turmoil, political uncertainty, you start to see these interruptions. The example that I gave in the book was around, we had a 2005 referendum. We had an amazing, successful referendum. And then we had a contentious election in 2007. And between those 2 years, when you look at the archives, you will see a great deal of interruption. All of the conflicts get edited out. All of the tensions get edited out. There was one episode where a cabinet secretary, a newspaper was burnt down, and the cabinet secretary was interviewed on television, and he was asked, he was told, we saw soldiers in uniform at this site. What do you have to say to that? And he says, well, what do you expect? If you rattle a snake, you can expect to get bitten. It was fundamentally an admission of guilt, that it was the state that was behind the burning down of this newspaper. It was very hard to find that record because it contradicts the narrative of reconciliation and peaceful Kenya and everything that had sort of came after the election. And so what you do, part of it is you're relying on your own recollection, because this is the history that you've lived. This is something that you have experienced, and you try and use methods that are responsive to that. One of the things that as a researcher, I studied political science, and political science is very much a realist in the theoretical sense of the word study. So you go and you do your big and quantitative survey, and you interview 1,000 people, and you ask them, how do you feel about your government? And then they say, well, that's research. But one of the things that you find when you're doing feminist research is that qualitative methods can be just as powerful as quantitative methods. Interviews, oral histories, talking to people can give you just as much rich data as sampling 20,000 people, a survey of 20,000 people. And so what I do with my methods is I do a lot of mixed methods. I try to talk, when I was researching the book, I just talk to people, corroborate stories, corroborate my own recollections as a participant observer with what other people have said and what other people have seen and what remember. And with Kenya, that's so important because when they say journalism is the first draft of history, our journalism is compromised. We see newspapers and we see television and we don't necessarily see the fullness of our reality. Today, the front pages of the newspapers are dominated by stories of the BBI, the peace, whatever agreement between the two main political factions. We have locust invasion in like 2/3 of the country. We have this threat of, this virus taking over the world. All of these major stories about who we are as a country have been completely editorialized off the front page. And so methods that are going to people and collecting storytelling becomes such a powerful method of preserving our histories, of filling in the gaps in the archive, of capturing things. And sometimes a person will say a story for one reason, but you get a separate data point from that. Sometimes a woman will tell you a story, for example, about how she used to walk 6 kilometers to go and look for water, and it was difficult, etc. And they all used to go as a group because it was not safe. And that's already a story about how women perceive safety in their own communities. She might not have been telling you that. She's focused on going to the river and doing that, but the fact that they have to go in a group is a story about safety. The fact that for example, women having that conversation on the way to the river is a story about camaraderie and friendship between women that might get edited out when they say, well, men used to go and drink their beer and that was our history. Women just used to work in the house. We say, well, they had 3 hours of walking to the river to talk to each other and to become friends. That's a separate data point. So that's how I try to do it, is to really lead into feminist methodologies about storytelling and the importance of storytelling. As an African woman, you are doubly or even trebly marginalized. Archives are based on what can be measured, on what can be seen, on what can be counted for the most part. And our lived experiences as African women until very recently were on what cannot be measured, what cannot be seen, what is only exists in story and network and community. And so leaning into those methods allows you to capture that, not just in terms of women's stories, but for me, as a feminist researcher working on terrain that is not necessarily about women, it opens up the space to me in a way that maybe my colleagues might not necessarily have or experience.
Absolutely. I have so many questions, but there's a question from the audience, so I feel like I should use that one, our virtual audience. We've talked about podcasts as a way to remember history, but how do you think it can be used to document the present?
That's a good question. I think that podcasts can be a very great temperature check on people. So I grew up listening to the radio. I had a radio at my bedside until I was well into my 20s, and I'm still trying to buy one. So if anyone wants to find me a radio, I'd be so grateful. And one of the things that podcasts do that radio struggled with was keeping the story alive after the broadcast is over. And how people respond to a story might evolve over time. So look, one of the podcast that everybody attributes the current boom to is Serial, the US podcast about capital punishment, really. And about taking what Serial did that is unspoken but acknowledged is shifting the conversation on capital punishment and making it less of a specialist conversation and an ordinary thing that everybody should be aware of and should be passionate about. And so I think what podcasts can do that, because you can share the story, you can share the experience beyond the current immediate broadcast and start to build a community around that and start to build a conversation around that beyond, everybody who listens to it. And it's a reflection, I guess, of how the way in which we consume media has also changed. Back in the day, it was 9:30 p.m. Everybody is watching The Bold and the Beautiful, Ridge and Stephanie and all of that stuff. And so we have that shared viewing experience. Then we go and have the water cooler conversations or the school conversations afterwards. But now we are able to sort of expand and extend that particular thing so that, you didn't listen to it at 9:30 yesterday. Here's the link. Listen to it at your own convenience. And the stories kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger that way. So to me, that's what podcasting can do in terms of helping us extend the contemporariness of the conversations and have a much more broad conversation than we would have had with a traditional broadcast of, if you were not listening at 9 p.m. and you missed the rerun at 7 a.m., you missed a moment. That's it. It's gone.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think that one of the most significant things is demand on content. Whereas before, if you have a favorite, broadcaster and they air a show and you miss it and that's it, but it allows you to go back and get it. But another thing as well is like, I'm not sure about Kenya, but in Zambia for sure, the media is controlled by the state, and that's the largest broadcaster. So if you're in a political dispensation and there are different views, sometimes it's hard to express yourself in a way where you're free or you'll be blocked out completely. And what podcast has done has allowed for alternative platforms for communities to discuss whatever topic. It can be politics, it can be sexuality, it can be feminism, and it has just provided a rich platform, a rich space where conversations now are being extrapolated, are multiplying, and they're continuously becoming safe spaces for people to go and find this information. And a lot of people are gravitating towards that because then we can talk about truth telling, because then you have different opinions, different narratives that you can compare and contrast and say, okay, what is it that I believe in, rather than being fed with propaganda. And that is a real game changer in podcasting.
Samba, with your experience with leading ladies, what are the stories that people seem to be responding to or craving? And what is it about those stories that you think is compelling in this moment?
I think the major one is the fact that there's the common thread or the running thread of strength. When they look at these women and what they represent is strength, they represent innovation, they represent a point of view that has not been seen before. And a lot of the comments that we're getting back is like, if I knew, both men and women, by the way, not just women, because initially we thought, oh, women are the only ones who respond to this. But men and women are saying that if we had learned this in schools, or if I had known this about Africa or Zambia or Zambian women, I would look at myself as an African in a different way, because then I would know that as Africans, as Zambians, we're strong people, we're intelligent, we're compassionate, and we fight for what we believe in, we fight for our identity, who we are, we know who we are. And more and more and more, that's the feedback we keep getting back. So, which is more obvious to us that there's a huge gap that needs to be filled.
Yeah. That's a really similar compulsion to us doing the Brazen podcast, is the idea that to tap into kind of a ferocity that always existed, that perhaps we need to remember who we were, to remember who we are and who we can be. And it's interesting and not surprising that this is shared across different countries on the continent.
Absolutely.
Nanjala, you've written before that you want to hold space. You write to hold space in the archive for people like me and the people I know. What does that mean? Who are people like you? Who are the people you know?
One of my favorite ever quotes comes from Arundhati Roy, when she talks about, we all know that there's no such thing as the voiceless, only the preferably unheard. And so what I see is holding space in the archives for the preferably unheard, is see my role as a researcher, as a writer, is to excavate the stories that people would rather not hear, the stories that make especially power uncomfortable, and to put them in a way that turns that discomfort into action and turns that discomfort into a point of advocacy. I see my role as making powerful people uncomfortable. And so I think holding space in the archive basically means, look, I might not necessarily get into the minutiae of all of this particular phenomenon. I might not spend, 10 years sort of getting into the nuts and bolts of this particular archives. But what I am going to do is tell you that it exists and hope that 5 years from now, there'll be another 5 researchers, another 6 podcasters, another 20, high school students who are interested in this subject, who'll be crawling through the archives and then go, oh my gosh, I knew this was a thing. And this comes from my own experience. When I was when Samba was talking, I remember the story of the Aba women's riots and how the story of colonial resistance in Africa has always been told as a male story, that it was the warriors who went out and did this, and it was the men who went out and did this, and it was the chiefs, the male chiefs who went and negotiated this. And I remember when I did my master's degree, my undergrad and my master's degree in African studies. And it was around the time this researcher, she was actually looking for something else. And she goes into the archives of the Rhodes collection, which is the largest collection of African colonial papers in the world. And it lives in Oxford, not in Abidjan or Nairobi or Lagos or Lusaka.
Yeah.
It's in Oxford. And so she goes into this archive and she's looking, and she finds this very small note in a district officer's notes about this women's riot. And it turned out that long before Nigerian men had marshaled and mobilized and organized and whatever, that market women in Aba, just outside Lagos, had organized a very violent resistance to the market tax that was organized by the British colonial administration, and had successfully dissuaded the colonial administration from imposing that tax. And it was violent. I mean, we're talking about multiple days of, women being ungovernable and saying, not on my watch. And this story is completely edited out in the way in which people think about resistance to colonization. People, even in Nigeria, I had Nigerian, colleagues go, I had never heard of this. And it's not ancient history. 1925. That's not ancient history. There are people who were born in 1925 who are still alive. And so we have to ask when I read that story, it completely changed the way that I thought about the value of my work. And this is probably about 10 years ago. It completely changed the way I think about the value of my work, because we are trained as academics in the academy to try and do everything, be so thorough in this really, really tiny, narrow thing that you do, and it will matter. But what that experience taught me is, well, what if we think about academia expansively and say, not everybody needs to research everything to its minutiae, but some of us just need to open up the space so the next 20 academics, so the next 30 people can come through and say, you know what, that thing is in the archive, I'm going to build my knowledge from that. That to me is what holding space in the archive means. Just open up that space. My role is to make it possible for as how I interpret it, is to make it possible for other African women to come through these doors. Is not necessarily to become the person who holds all the knowledge about this particular tiny, tiny, tiny thing. That's what it means to me, is I'm making space for other people to build on that work, because knowledge has to be a collective exercise. It can't just be, the Western canon encourages us to think about ourselves as philosopher kings, that this one person, I am the person who invented gravity, I am the person who invented electricity, as if. But as a feminist, as an African feminist, we can think about knowledge making as a communal effort, and we can say, well, I'm going to resist this philosopher king paradigm and have a communal paradigm that says, let's make space for all of us to be able to participate in this exercise of knowledge making.
Yeah, that's very valid. I feel the same way, because when we released Leading Ladies, a very close friend of mine, well educated and all of this, sometimes education can be a problem. And And he was like, well, do you honestly think he was a guy? Do you honestly think this is going to make, this is going to change the mind of a man who's a chauvinist? Do you think you'll make him believe in feminism? I just said to him, that's not my job. My job is to ensure that this content is out there so that 10 years down the line, anybody who comes to see it, he might watch it now and not believe in it. And 10 years later, it would have taught him something new, and that's the whole point. Is we're not here to change anybody or convert anyone. We're not the church of gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're here to make the future possible.
Exactly. Agreed.
Just the fact that it exists is important.
Exactly. Exactly.
One of the challenges we faced when we were writing Brazen is primary research, primary resources. And we really wanted to lean on material that was written by women. And it was very difficult to find. And Mekatilili Wamenza, who was, in her 70s as she led one of the successful colonial uprisings, similar to the story that you shared, Nanjala, every single source pointed back to one white woman. And that just felt so wrong to be drawing her story from not the center, felt wrong.
Yeah.
And so in a way, my dream, my selfish dream, is, for example, your podcast, Samba, to be a primary source for women to go back when they're searching for these stories, to not have to go to a necessarily a written archive, but to be able to listen to the voices of other African women tell these stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think tied to this is also a request or an invitation to everybody to talk to their grandmothers and to talk to their mothers, because there's so many stories that, like I said, it might not give you, your grandmother might not have been the leader of a revolutionary movement, but she might give you insight into that particular community that will help shift the conversation around how we think about women's agency and how we think about women's place in the community. I think that there's a story I think that was going around in Kenyan social media about this woman who was Dedev Kimathi's field wife. So a lot of the resistance, they had wives that they had married either in church or in customary marriage, and then when they were in the forests resisting colonization, they would be in couples. They would have forest wives. And she, because she converted and became a Christian, has completely refused to tell the story of the 10 years, the 9 years that she spent in the forest resisting colonization. I mean, that's a tremendous archival loss. And of course, we respect her agency and we respect her. It's her story to tell. But in the broader context, I think for me, it was a reminder that we need to talk to our grandmothers about their stories. And our stories, the stories of our families must not necessarily come through our grandfathers, even though that is the way in which the Victorians imagine how history functions. I come from a long line of women who broke the rules and who got into a lot of trouble for not necessarily subscribing to the way in which our traditions interpret the role of women. And I take a great deal of inspiration from that, but it also helps me think broadly. Well, the things that you're telling me, when people say things like Africans never used to divorce, I think, well, both my grandparents on both sides were divorced, and this is long before any of them had ever seen a white person. Forget about, interacting with them. They had never even seen a white person, and they both, on both sides of the family, and it was the women who left. So, there's something about just these stories that help us challenge narratives about ourselves that I think is really important. And if we talk to the women in our lives, to our grandmothers, I think we'll see ourselves and our histories in a different way from the very masculinist narratives about what Africans do, and Africans don't do that, and this thing is not African. I think the stories of women will really help us sort of tear that construct apart.
The other thing I think it does is it challenges the idea that the archive must only have stories of the spectacular. and actually
Exactly.
communal every day is the way that women work. We don't privilege, even as Makatilili was standing up, she was supported by, hundreds of women who the little acts are just as important and enable what is seen as a big act.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Absolutely.
again, it's resisting that model of the philosopher king that you must invent electricity for your contribution to human society to be meaningful. Well, what about the person who invented the spoon? The spoon has probably done just as much for human, as electricity. But we focus on this philosopher king model, and then we say, well, the spoon can't be. It's too mundane. It's too quotidian. It's too everyday. It has to be spectacular for it to be meaningful. And I think that's like you said, it's a really dangerous way of thinking about the value of history.
Yeah, and I think what I find interesting about it as well is the whole thing of how our mothers or the women's stories have been muted because of the introduction of Christianity. When you're speaking, Nanjala, about the lady who refused to tell her story about Dead and Kimathi because now she's a Christian, I find the same thing across a lot of women in Zambia. They won't talk about their, not even just like if they did something significant, but even if they had a passion, a drive, especially our grandmothers, like if they suddenly said that they had wanted to drive a car, they won't talk about it. Or they did drive a car, they'll be like, oh, that's too, risque. We can't talk about things like that. And when you interrogate them further, you're like, what? You were like a superwoman. Why don't you talk about this? So you find this whole narrative that's just muted because they are like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm a Christian. I'm not supposed to be talking about
Yeah.
such things. And these are the things that we really need to pry out. And we're so excited about finding out, especially, as our grandmothers are getting older, as our mothers are getting older, to really just document, because that is valid too. It shows a collective mindset of resilience, a collective mindset of curiosity, exploration, which more often than not, we're told that we don't have.
Yeah.
And the other thing I love about podcasting is the opportunity to record voice. And I mean the opportunity to have our grandmothers' voices be recorded in every shade of timbre that exists, because that feels quite new in the world, and in a way in how accessible it is. Samba, when it comes to podcasting, what is it that sound is able to do that any other medium can't do, in your experience?
I think especially what is really important is because whereas in probably a lot of other civilizations, they might have photographs, they might have some video, they might have some kind of documentation to back up the imagination, to build that imagination. We don't. All we have is the voice. So what podcasting allows us to do is recreate and reimagine this future and this past, using the voice, using the sounds, using sound effects, using the instruments that were used, and you're literally transported back. I mean, you could just go outside and record the ambience, record the voice, and then use the traditional instrument or any kind of instrumentation, and immediately it creates this world that was almost obscured or even invisible. You couldn't even imagine it, and now you can almost smell it. And that's what I love about audio and podcasting.
And I love that it allows me in Kenya to listen to what Zambia sounds like, because
Exactly.
it's not, the crossing borders in this continent isn't as easy as it should be.
Yeah.
No.
Nanjala, what do you think what are the ways in which podcasts present an opportunity to maybe shift the power in contemporary society?
When I think about what Samba said about, state broadcast monopolies and state influence over traditional media, I think that's the easiest answer, is allowing ordinary people to be part of storytelling and to be part of creating the archive of their contemporary society, and sort of circumventing the gatekeepers. I think it allows for creativity also, and we start to see us in our broadest sense, so that the entry level, the requirements rather, to enter the podcasting space are much lower than, for example, to become a radio presenter, to go and work for the state broadcaster. So it gives us a diversity of voices, and allows us to see our societies as complex. Again, the other narrative that's really dominant is, well, Africans don't, and Africans are, and Africans are. And so the podcast is allowing people to sort of write against that narrative, because that narrative has always come either defined from the outside. So it is, the word Africa is rooted very much in Latin, in how Europe saw this continent south of themselves. And in history books, in museums, in contemporary archives, Africa has always been defined as what Europe is not. Look at the story of COVID-19. Everybody's like, why is this happening to us and not to them? And so what the podcasting does is allows that diversity of voices to say, well, actually, we are who we are, independently of what Europe is, independently of what the West is. And it gives a power, it allows us to exist in much more diversity, in that particular vein. The ways in which, for example, Kenyan politics is defined, and people say, well, Africans have ethnic politics. And you say, well, that's the story because it's an easy narrative that dominates our press, that dominates all the research that's been done about Kenya, and all of that stuff. And here comes a podcaster who spends their entire broadcast talking to people from groups other than their own, talking to people who are not necessarily centered on power. So I'm not doing like a series that I'm just talking to politicians, but I'm talking to ordinary people, and how ordinary people see their ethnic identities and see their political identities. And you start to see a different picture form. You start to see, well, maybe this thing isn't important. Maybe it's just important to powerful people, but maybe it's not important to my lived reality. And this is the advantage of democratizing the media space, which is what podcasting does. When we talk about sound, I think it allows you to really narrow down on these particular nuances in a way in which mass communication really just doesn't. That you could have an entire podcast, for example, that's talking about Rebecca Rabukoza. She's Ugandan. She has, I'll make sure that I pronounce that correctly. She has a podcast that is basically Rakabukoza. She has a podcast that is basically excavating very unique stories about Ugandan women, that it's not about sensationalism. It's not about telling these explosive stories, but it's really just about what it was like to be an ordinary Ugandan woman in different sort of specific contexts. That's telling a different story about Ugandan womanhood in a country where the person who has defined the standards for Ugandan womanhood for the last 30 years is a man, is the president of the country, who says Ugandan women don't wear trousers, Ugandan women don't do this, Ugandan women don't do that. Allowing women to have that space to say, actually, well, we do, is a really powerful political statement.
Samba, do you have any thoughts around that, about how podcasts are shifting the power structure and maybe even collective identity?
Definitely. I mean, we've just been talking about, we're working around what are social injustice influences. And we're finding that a lot of them actually exist on platforms on media. And one of them is podcasting, just like Nanjala was saying, whereas the political narrative is propagating one idea, you find that everywhere else it's actually different. The conversations are different. And most of the people are listening and understanding and can see the deception and the difference, and they can make decisions based on that. Whereas before, they would just rely on what the state is telling them, and they would believe that, oh, the ethnic differences in this area is because of this. But on the ground, because of the alternative platforms of communication and exchange of ideas, they can actually talk back immediately. And that's the great thing with podcasting and these communication platforms, because you can talk back and actually say, no, excuse me, Mr. President, what you're saying is not true. You're the one who thinks that and wants all of us to believe that, and we're not for that idea. And we just love that. Yeah.
Yeah, something very powerful about hearing a voice speak that, a real human voice also. And the idea that you don't have to have a written word. There's a privilege of written word that exists that podcast starts to shift.
Yeah.
It looks like we don't have, we're now coming to the end of this conversation.
Whoa.
I have about 4 more pages full of questions. But I guess I just want to ask you perhaps about any last thoughts you have, and also about what you imagine the opportunities and possibilities hold for the medium and for the types of content that you think could come from.
I really want to see more organic content from, like I said, the preferably unheard. I would love to see, as much as podcasting does allow this democratization, it still has played, it still also resonates with a lot of the existing power dynamics. So, we have urban centers, for example, being sites of, and African cities have always taken up a lion's share of the conversation, of the media and the public conversation. I would love to see and hear more podcasts from unusual corners of the world. And it's something I've always thought about doing, but then I'm busy. But it would be great. Wouldn't it be great, for example, to have a podcast series that's, young women from Chad have an hour where they talk about what their day-to-day life is, and someone from Nairobi can listen in, as you were saying, and hear about what life is like, away from the fear of war and the fear of everything, and just like, this is a thing that we're talking about in Chad, which is, this new makeup style. Is it good or is it not good? Or, this particular politician said this in office, what does this reflect? How is this being interpreted? Or, where this new food, that's the first sushi joint that has opened in, this small capital away from the centers of power, this is how locals are responding to it. I'd love to see conversations that reflect the diversity of the everyday experience, away from our capitals and away from our economic centers. They're actually telling the story that, Africa is a big, diverse, complicated, fascinating, exciting place, not just through the lens of this Western lens of adventure and mystery and whatever, but even in our day-to-day, we are just like super interesting. And African women, just like super interesting and super diverse and super complicated. And to be able to have more podcasts that reflect that, I think would be a tremendous win, especially all the other things that we've been talking about, as podcasts become much more integral to our archives. It would be great for those stories to also be in that archive.
Absolutely. Samba,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree 100% with Nanjala, especially the idea of diversity. And I think the diversity in knowledge, in innovation, but also speaking to this idea of or prevalence of fragmentation. Like, we're such a big continent and we're so many different people and we have ideas in different places. I mean, I think podcast presents this opportunity to create this kind of critical mass that comes together and that can impact globally. I mean, just like the way we've been impacted by the United States and their diversity, the European Union, them coming together, like, podcasts could be the voices of the diversity of Africans coming together and saying, this is who we are, this is our knowledge, this is how we feel we can impact the world, and this is how we can contribute to the evolution and change and development of the world. I'm so excited by that idea,
Yeah, I'm also really excited about the idea of challenging what cultural heritage is. As a Kenyan, my association with cultural heritage is grass skirts dancing for our former dictator.
Right.
And when he died, one of the things that came out was a was a YouTube playlist through the ages of resistance music. And that too is cultural heritage. And so I'm kind of curious about what the space that podcasting can hold to challenge what gets to be called our heritage. And I think finally, just to wind down, an opportunity for you to give a shout out to any podcasts, books, references, things that you are thinking about reading, watching, listening to, that are kind of part of your ether when you think about this topic.
I've already talked. Yeah, I know, right? I've already talked about Rebecca. She's Ugandan. She's doing a fantastic job. I love, like I said, I love radio, but I have such very niche interests in radio that are very difficult to. I would love for someone to do a podcast on classical music in Africa. And I mean that broadly, like, like someone to do just like a music-driven podcast talking to some of our great musicians before they passed. We lost Tuku, and we lost Hugh Masekela, and we've lost Daudi Kabaka, and I would just love to have a podcast that's focused on musicians and music and how we make music. That would be great. But at the moment, I'm listening to a lot of political podcasts, which is really dull and dry. Trying to get a handle on the world and what people are thinking about where the world is and where it's going. I hope that where people will look up the Missing Voices podcast. It's only 6 episodes long. Each episode is about 30 to 40 minutes. And each episode is a story about the people who were left behind when someone was executed by the police in Kenya. And it's up, I think, wherever you can look at the website, but it's also up wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, Nanjala. Samba,
thank you. We'll definitely check that out. Well, for me, I'm just really excited about Africa Pod Festival and the fact that you're bringing all of us together. I mean, I think when we started, it was just so, because I listen to a lot of podcasts. So when the idea came to create this as an animated podcast, it was an isolated feeling. It was like, yeah, only the West do this. So then to discover as months went on that so many other Africans are doing podcasts, I was like, man, I want to listen to this all the time, every time, get together with all this. That this has been fun. Like, can we do this every week? Like, get the podcast together. So I'm so excited.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. Just tap into all that knowledge. Nanjala, you said so many names. Aleya, you said so many names. I've made notes. I'm like, I'm going to find all those people. So the fact that we can all come together is just priceless. I love it. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you both. And also just for the listeners out there, to remind you where you can find Samba and Nanjala's work. So Samba is a co-founder of the Women's History Museum in Zambia as a way to cast African women in the past as superheroes. And the animated podcast is called Leading Ladies. It is beautiful and also just badass. I love it so much.
Thank you.
And Nanjala's book can be found. Nanjala, is it online? Kindle? Is there a Kindle version? Did we lose Nanjala? Hello?
I think so. I think she's frozen.
Okay, so if you Google Nanjala, you're gonna find a whole bunch of material out there. She is one of the most prolific writers right now, and has written a book that is really is a primary source for so many. Digital Democracy is what it's called. So look for it. I think we've lost Nanjala, so this feels like a good time to say goodbye. I think
already.
It's crazy. Thank you so much, Samba. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aleya. It's been really lovely.
And I hope that we get a chance to do this again, and hopefully it's time in.
And to connect as well, yes.
Yeah.